So this month, our topic is just and sustainable food systems. In recognition that agriculture is the most important economic sector, the most dependent on healthy ecosystems, and also the greatest threat to those ecosystems. And unfortunately, the human and ecological costs of the current system are borne disproportionately by the poor, with the benefits flowing disproportionately to the rich. So our three panelists today are going to be focusing on elements of just and sustainable food systems. It'll be Aidee Guzman, who's a PhD student at Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, Jason Bradford, who's board president of the Post-Carbon Institute, and Sabine O'Hara, who's director of the University of the District of Columbia's PhD program in urban leadership and entrepreneurship. And I'll provide more detailed introductions before each presentation. So each panelist is going to have about 15 minutes to present their work, and followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. And participants can post your questions and comments to the chat on Zoom or on Facebook. And my colleagues Dina Spigelski and Ursula Giorgio will read them and pass them on to me as the moderator. And we'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions for the whole group, although unfortunately, Aidee will have to leave a little early. So moving right on to introduce Aidee. So Aidee Guzman is our first panelist. She's wrapping up her PhD research at Berkeley, where she's advised by Dr. Claire Kremen and Dr. Timothy Bowles. Claire Kremen has told me she's really a rising superstar in the field, and we're very excited to have her. She has deep family roots in agriculture. Her highly interdisciplinary research is focused on understanding the socio-ecological linkages of diversifying farming systems. She's working with small-scale farmers embedded in the monoculture landscape of California's Central Valley to investigate how on-farm diversification practices impact soil health and link to other ecological processes such as pollination and agroecosystems. And she really tries to make her research help support farmers' rural livelihoods and ecological resilience. So the title of her talk is From Soils to Bees: How Small-Scale Farmers Are Cultivating Fertile Grounds for Agroecology in California's San Joaquin Valley. So I'm really excited to turn the floor over to Aidee.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So I always love starting my presentations, especially talks like this, with this artwork by Ricardo Levens Morales. And it's basically two coffee farms. In the background is this sort of sun-grown monoculture coffee farm. And then in the foreground, superimposed is sort of this vision of how we can reimagine this landscape into more of a coffee agroforestry system. And it kind of frames a lot of the way I look at my research and sort of trying to think about agricultural landscapes. And so like Josh mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about my dissertation research, and it's mostly focused on how small-scale farmers in California's San Joaquin Valley are supporting soil health and pollinators in this landscape. And I'm at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at Berkeley. So like I said, my research sort of focuses on sort of this bigger question about how can we make agricultural landscapes work for both the environment and people. And, in the background is sort of aerial image of one of the farm sites I work on, which is a small farm next to these monocultures. And this work sort of takes me at the intersection of these different multiple components, which include beneficial soil organisms, in particular arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, beneficial insects, bees, specifically specialist bees, and how farming practices affect this, all within the context of its system. I tend to think about agricultural systems and not just ecological, but inherently social. And so it's about how we can support the farmers that I'm working with. And so my research is focused right in the middle of California, specifically in the Fresno region in California. And most people, when they think about California, they think about, far beyond agriculture. They think about sort of the Bay Area where I'm located right now, or you think about down in SoCal, near LA, or you think about the beautiful Yosemite Valley, or just the giant redwoods. But right in the middle of the Central Valley, or the San Joaquin Valley specifically, there's lots of agriculture. And it's actually, there's a giant agricultural powerhouse, which, as this footage is showing, is these giant monocultures. And I grew up in the region, and you could drive for a couple minutes and still be in the same field. And it's produces a lot of fruits and vegetables in a very industrial monoculture fashion. But lots of different things like almonds, oranges, pistachios, pomegranates, cotton, etc. But together, this is actually 40% of the fruits and nuts consumed in the US. And most people, when they then think about agriculture in California, if they do, they also then think about sort of the all the different things that are bad with it. And they sort of take this very negative approach of, it's a degraded landscape with contaminated soils. There's just this legacy of industrial agriculture, and that there's poor public health outcomes. And, having grown up in that region, it's definitely something that I get surrounded with even when I step out of my hometown. But if you ever driven through this area or spent some time, what you would find in the middle of this landscape are really small scale diversified farms. And they're surrounded all by this monocultures. And so here you see a small farm, and it's actually like one farmer here and another one here growing tons of crops. And so here's some footage that a kind friend of mine took of one of the farms that I've been working on. And the small scale farms that I've been working on are less than 25 acres. They grow like throughout a year, like 50 to 100 different crops. So on a small piece of land, they're growing high numbers of crops, which you can see here, it really sharply contrasts the surrounding landscape. And some of those crops, are ginger, taro, peanuts, moringa, jujube, gourds. It's really diverse types of crops that sometimes you wouldn't even imagine growing here in the area. But within this landscape, it represents 2,000 farmers, but it's actually less than 1% of the entire land in this region. And so it's really, these biodiverse oases, these hotspots in the middle of this landscape. And for me, when I started thinking about working here, I sort of started seeing this as like a glimmers of hope of like, how do we sort of move forward from this industrial landscape? And so a lot of people usually don't believe me when I talk about these systems, and here's some maps that some student made, and it's row by row differences of crops. And so my research, I sort of look at the monocultures versus the polycultures. And here's some more beautiful images of some of the crops that are being grown there. There's seeded bitter melon, opal squash, jujube, lemongrass, etc. And I think before moving on towards some of my research findings, I think it's really important to highlight some of the farmers. And so what I'll do next is I'll talk about briefly some of the research I've been doing and the findings I have, and then talk about sort of the context in which the farmers exist. And so what I think is really important to think about, these are really beautiful farms, but I think what's most important is who are the farmers? And predominantly the farmers on these really small scale systems in a really marginal land are predominantly immigrant refugee farmers, mostly of Mexican descent, or they're Hmong. And they've come and farmed in this region and sort of landed on these small pieces of land that seems to sharply contrast the surrounding landscape. And so sort of taking this all together, I came into this thinking like, okay, so now we have, this landscape, which has been monocultures. Now we have these farms, these really small scale farms in this monoculture landscape. So I started thinking about what happens if we go the opposite direction in this landscape, which these farmers are taking us. And so what happens when you go from this monoculture and we start diversifying this land? And, it's really interesting to think about sort of, the way it always gets perceived in this degraded format. But what happens when we go the opposite direction? Like what happens below ground and what happens above ground? And so, like I said, I sought out to compare sort of monoculture and polyculture farms. And first I started below ground. I was really curious, how it affected the soil organisms. And I specifically focus on Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which, gets talked about a lot as, being everywhere, sort of the rule rather than the exception. But agriculture has really sharply decreased the diversity of them. So then, like I said, is like you have 100 years or more of this monoculture, like what happens below ground? And so focusing on these organisms, what's really important about them is that they can sort of be biological indicators of soil health, because they help regulate nutrients and also water cycles in the soil, and also help with a bunch of other things like drought tolerance. But these organisms also can be drastically affected by sort of chemical inputs, tillage, monocropping over time. And so comparing these farms in the area, I measured sampled soils, and I measured how, what's the diversity below ground. And what we found is that crop diversity enriches AMF communities. And this paper was recently published. And what sort of one of the takeaways is that in this, sort of industrial landscape, that plant diversity is actually key to sort of restoring or re-enriching this agroecosystem. And it was surprising to find this result, because we even found this result on all these farms that had been previously intensively managed. And then I took these questions above ground. So what's happening above ground? And so I decided to focus on specialist bees. And in particular, the reason why is because they're so highly dependent on its crop or a plant. And I decided to focus on squash bees, which you can see here in the background. And one of the reasons why is because sort of squash has these separate flowers that produce pollen, and then one that sort of receives the pollen. And they're open really early in the morning and only open for one day. So they have a short window of time. And its specialist pollinator, the squash bee, specializes on the squash pollen. And it's expanded its range with sort of the cucurbits, the squash family. And it's also really active at sunrise. And I worked on bees quite a bit before starting my PhD. And what's really funny about these squash bees is that they're up at sunrise, whereas honeybees, they're up at 9. They take it really easy. And so they love the warm weather, and squash bees will be out. They're really tied to squash flowers. And even it's really cute, they'll sleep inside the squash flowers. But I was curious, okay, so like, we have a monoculture field of squash. Do bees prefer that over a polyculture that only has maybe perhaps, a few rows of squash? And so I went in there thinking like, perhaps, in this case, perhaps, monocultures of squash might be really good for squash bees. What we found is actually the opposite, that on-farm diversification or these polycultures support tons more squash bees on these fields. And perhaps one of the main reasons for that is because these farms are not just growing squash in one period of time, they're growing squash over time. And so constantly sort of putting in rows of squash. And they're also not disturbing the fields that much. They sort of take out one crop and then put the other. And they also have tons of other floral nectar resources that the bees might need on top of just pollen. And to sum up at this point, what happens when we diversify farms? In the research that I've been working on, we find that they support specialist pollinators, and they also can enrich the AMF community that's been so greatly depleted. But I think beyond that, I think, as, when I put my ecologist hat on, this is amazing news. This is like great. These farms are sort of persisting in the landscape. I mean, supporting ecosystem services in the landscape. They're, doing really good things for the ecology. But I think it goes beyond that. And I think in terms of thinking about just the ecosystem, in terms of just thinking about ecological resilience, is not just about sort of diversifying farms. It sort of takes the whole system. And like I said, agriculture is inherently a social system. And so one way to look at this from like another positive angle is that the range of crops being grown here are not just, almonds and paste tomatoes in the region. They're culturally relevant foods that people in the community can eat. And, these are really important crops for a lot of communities. And some farmers grow jicama, or some farmers grow that one crop that, they need for the food. And it's actually nourishing in a much more cultural way than, I say chocolate covered almonds or almonds in a trail mix or paste tomatoes. And my mom works in one of the tomato factories there, and a lot of the sauces go to Domino's and Subway, which is so deeply disconnected from sort of the culture aspect of it. And like I said, what I think was most important about the system I'm working in are the farmers. And the reason why is because, they're providing all these ecological benefits, both below ground and, in terms of improving the soil health in the system, and above ground and sort of supporting biodiversity. But at the same time, they're dealing with a lot. And so in the first year that I sampled all the fields, the next year, half of the farmers were no longer farming because they had lost their land. And so a lot of these small scale farms that are diversified no longer had access to their land. And, one of them had the landowners kick them out. One of them had like a housing, the landowner who they were renting from sold it to housing development because they thought that was more profitable than their farming. And especially during the last major drought, a lot of them couldn't actually dig deeper wells to actually continue farming. And then there's research that shows how, at least with my own thing, I'm not going to present those findings because they're not finalized. The almond production went increased during this period, but these farmers struggle to keep there. They also really struggle selling the markets. And so in the San Joaquin Valley, it's really difficult to find markets. So a lot of the farmers here, some of the farmers I work with are just down at the Berkeley Farmers Market or in Long Beach in Southern California. And so they have to travel really far and have to work, all hours of the night, Friday night to get on the road at 2 a.m. to get out there. A lot of them also don't know how to access technical assistance or some of the incentives that the government may provide. And so one of the farmers actually, wanted livestock on their farm, but then got, really hunted down by food safety. And so they didn't really know how to navigate that. Or some of them are selling at packing houses, but they don't know how to deal with food safety. And so I'll end there by sort of showing this this image, and I like showing this image to sort of capture sort of this aspect of like what's happening. And so here's points of some of the farms I've been working on. And so here are the arrows for some of those farms and the farmers markets are selling at in the Bay Area. So it's definitely leaving the area. And so some of the possible solutions and things that I've been thinking about for the system is sorry about that, is sort of like equitable access to these program incentives. It's really exciting to see some of the stimulus bill is going to go to farmers of color, that there's programs that are appropriate for small scale farmers of immigrant refugee backgrounds, that Spanish language, Hmong language, and some of the farm extension advisors I'm working there are doing some of this work, and also land access and tenure for small scale farmers, and also market diversification in the San Joaquin Valley, to keep some of this in the local area, and not have to trek at 2 a.m. really sleepy to reach a market hours and hours away. So I'm going to end there, and I have time for questions. Of course, I just want to acknowledge all the farmers I've been working with and tons of undergraduate and high school research assistants I've been working with. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Aidee. That was great.